Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Respected viewers, this is just going to be a short video to address some objections again by Christian missionaries. Now, Christian missionaries, their objections take different forms. Some of them are actually seeking the truth. That's a very small portion of them. But the vast majority of them are in many cases simply seeking to confuse people and to try and mock Islam, and that is generally their goal.
قرآني نبض حياتي قرآني طهر ذاتي قرآني عصمة أمري قرآني طوق نجاتي قرآني نبض حياتي قرآني طهر ذاتي قرآني عصمة أمري
An example of this is what we're going to be talking about today, and you can see this picture on the screen, right? So people have been sharing this and saying this is what the Quran says Allah is, and they quote different verses from the Quran and they say, see, this is what the Quran says about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now a Muslim just reading this, he's seeing verses of the Quran being quoted. He may not even open those verses. If he does open the verses, he sees something there about eyes, about hands, about shin, and so he's confused. He has no idea what to do. And so it is our responsibility here to explain the Islamic position on anthropomorphism, which is also known as tajseem in Islamic terminology. So the guiding principle when it comes to the Quran and understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in addition to many of the verses, is the verse لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states categorically that there is nothing in existence that resembles Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any substantial way. And using these and other verses in the Quran which speak about ta'ala Allahu amma yushrikun, subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is over and above the qualities of human beings, the ulama are unanimous that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be described as being a physical corporeal body. And this verse of the Quran, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, when you understand the linguistic connotations of this, it's very, very, very clear that to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or to liken Him to the creation in any way is completely impermissible. And that's why you find in Islamic history there was a group, a deviant group called the Mujassima or the Mushabbiha. Those people who, and Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah says, many people actually regarded them to be out of the fold of Islam because na'udhu billah, they believed or they would say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a jism, has a body which is unlike our jism. This is completely against the Islamic position. We can see from the verse of the Quran. When you look at any book of the ulama of Islam when it comes to Aqidah, take Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, all of those who follow them, clearly they have a section in their book, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have body parts. This is the unanimous view of all Orthodox Muslims since the time of Sahaba radiallahu anhum. So what are these verses talking about then? Right? If we look at the verses that people quote to come up with pictures like the one we just saw, then you'll see that I'll just quote some of the verses that they're going to use. So, for example, when they talk, they say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has hands, right? Now, what verse will they quote? They'll quote the verse where the Jews said that Yadullahi maghlula. The Jews were saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking you all to donate money for the sake of Islam. Why doesn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have money? Yadullahi maghlula, which means the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are tied. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bal yadahu mabsutatan. Rather, His hands are outstretched. Now, anyone with a brain reading this in context knows that the verses the Jews were trying to say, why doesn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you all money? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving people benefits all the time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives as He pleases. It's not talking about a hand or a physical hand or anything like that in the sense that we're talking about. You look at other examples, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about Musa alayhi salam, and he wanted Musa alayhi salam to grow up in the court of Fir'aun. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَىٰ عَيْنِي, so that you may be brought up under my care. If you read the translations of the Quran, literally under my two eyes, وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَىٰ عَيْنِي, in front of me. But what it means is so that you may be brought up under my care. Like as we say in English, I want you, he must be under my eyes, under my supervision. That's what we mean by that. Or we say, can I lend you a hand? It's a metaphorical figurative way of expressing a certain thing. It has no connotation or no meaning of this being actually having the hand or having something like that in a physical way. So we understand basically by this small summary that using the verse of the Quran, the ulama of Islam are unanimous that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be described as having body parts literally, or having a corporeal body, or even existing like, as we exist. Na'udhu billah. All of this, many ulama have said that this is complete kufr. It doesn't fit with what Islam is talking about. Secondly, the verses that they are using to do this do not speak about, and they will use a verse, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a shin. So, يَوْمَ يُكْشَفُ عَنْ سَاقٍ. Go and read that verse and see whether it has anything to do with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having a physical shin. None of these verses imply any physicality, any corporeality. Rather, you will see that they are expressions and they are linguistic terminologies used to give off meanings, right? But before we end off on this topic, I just want to quote, because generally people who are quoting these sort of things are Christians. And so in the Christian Bible, it's not so clear that these are figures of speech or metaphors in some cases. So when you look in the Bible, you see that God has eyes in Amos chapter number 9 verse number 3. You see that God has ears in Deuteronomy chapter number 9 verse number 18. You see that God has feet in Genesis chapter number 3 verse number 8 and Isaiah 63:3. And in Genesis, you see God is walking. And when you keep reading also in Genesis, you see that they can hear the sound of God walking in the garden. This is really anthropomorphic stuff. And many people, you see the rabbis coming later, had to reinterpret these verses because there was no way of understanding how can you hear God walking. You see that God speaks, He closes the door, He plants gardens, He takes a rest. God feels grief and regret in the Bible. So when you look at the biblical picture, it doesn't have that guiding verse, Laysa kamithlihi shay. And you see all of these expressions of laughing, walking, having eyes, ears, feet, the sound of the walking also. So how is a person supposed to understand this? So this is again just another classic example of Christians throwing stones in glass houses. So if you enjoy that, please like, subscribe, share the video. Jazakallah khair.
قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي، قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. آيات الله حمتني غمرتني بالبركات، تحفظني من همزات الشيطان ومن زلاتي. آيات الله حمتني غمرتني بالبركات، تحفظني من همزات الشيطان ومن زلاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي.